after. So, hey, you're on the Wake Up Show with Christy Simone on the Live the Dream Media Network. It's an all yes Wednesday. John Anderson actually will be on the show very soon. We're working on that interview. When I was talking to my boy Scott, who's one of my booking buddies, about our next guest, he said Steven Wilson, and I said, Barney Brenner, good morning, sir. Welcome back.
Good morning, Chris.
I thought it was
Good morning, Wakies.
Absolutely. I thought it was Steven Wilson from the group Porcupine Tree, but it turned out to be Steven Wilson from the Pioneer Institute. And let's bring him on right now. You're not the guy from Porcupine Tree, is what I'm.
No, sadly, I know you're disappointed.
Steven, welcome to the show, my friend.
Great to be with you. How are you?
We're doing fine. Tell me what a Pioneer Institute does.
A Pioneer Institute does public policy research, and my focus is on education and specifically on urban education and charters.
Look at you. And talk about the Steven Wilson road to getting to such a place in your life. Well, tell us about.
I started in tech, and then I worked for Governor Weld in Massachusetts and helped to develop the 1993 Education Reform Act, which was, it was an extraordinary experience because it was one of the few cases where we were really successful. So Massachusetts now has been the top of the 50 states for a long while, although that's in jeopardy. And that was the beginning of my work. And then I moved into actually running charter schools in Brooklyn, New York.
Well, then you're so. Let's before so. The Waiting for Superman movie, which made such a splash, where is Steven Wilson on that movie in relation to what they were trying to portray, and the idea that urban kids' parents wanted them to go to a better school than what the city of New York was offering them? Give me your. This will tell me a lot about where we're at here. Give me the Waiting for Superman review.
That's such a great way in, right? Because that was the peak of the enthusiasm and the public belief that urban charters could make a difference for so many families and their kids. And then that continued to a roughly 2020. So in 2015 through 19, Stanford did a study of urban charters around the country. And what they found was that they were not only closing, but reversing longstanding achievement gaps. So children, Hispanic families, Black families were now performing as well or better than students, white students from suburban or more affluent settings. This was a total triumph. And then in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning, we could have doubled down. We could have scaled that approach that was doing amazing things. Instead, and this is the subject of my new book, we walked away from it. We started to undo what was working so well. And that is the rise of what I call social justice education. We turned away from great teaching as the North Star in these schools to instead social emotional learning, treating all children as inherently traumatized, trying to recruit them for a political purpose. And look, we can acknowledge the good intentions there, but what actually happened is that test scores and outcomes just plummeted in those schools. But the schools that stay true to their mission of academic excellence continue to tower over all the other schools in their districts.
Hold on,
so I think that's very important.
Our friend Barney's got a question for you.
Steven,
Great.
How did the lockdown in 2020 coincide with the problems you had of the trajectory going south?
Well, I think that there are many different strands in there, Barney. But what we found was that as these ideas of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and the others with this very with us or against us, oppressors and oppressed, pitting staff against one another in these schools. That was easier in an online environment because people didn't have to sit face to face with one another in the faculty room and talk about things. Instead, they could just destroy each other on the chat side of a Zoom call. So that definitely contributed to this rancorous environment where the cultures of these schools turned hostile and the focus on working together to do whatever it takes to help kids was lost. So that was definitely a contributor. In the majority systems, the big districts, there was just a tremendous amount of apathy towards the fact that kids were falling incredibly behind and we weren't doing anything about it. I mean, the toll in human lives is really staggering. And it really revealed that big districts are just not very serious about kids. They're not very serious about outcomes.
I think that's a money quote right there, Stephen. Yeah, Barn.
How much did the fact that parents may not have been monitoring what their kids are doing and are assuming that the schools are doing a good job of teaching them, how much did a factor is that in also the education system, declining over the years?
Yeah, well, I think that actually cut two ways, and we're still figuring that out. But the first way is what you're describing, which is that parents, I think, rightfully expected that, especially parents from poverty, that the schools would be responsible. They would educate their students. And that was one thing amidst all the precarity of their lives, food, everything else, just getting stuff on the table that they didn't have to worry about. But of course, that's quite wrong. They do need to worry about it. And the pandemic revealed that in many cases because they joined their kids on these Zoom calls and they saw what was happening. It was a wake-up call that the teaching was not what was needed and their children were really struggling. So that led to an exodus of a lot of students to charters, to homeschooling, to other settings, because they knew they had to act and do something differently. So in New York, we have about 100,000 kids that have just vanished from the schools, and I'm sure that the pandemic played a huge role in that.
Tell me about when you said the George Floyd and the change of attitude, and you had all of these success stories with all of these urban schools for African American kids and Hispanic kids. That was it just the idea that the charter schools just turned on a dime and said, we're not doing rigor. We're not doing, the basics of what we're so good at. And they just shifted at that right after that moment.
No, it was more gradual. It started, Chris, way back in probably around 2015, if I were to pick a date. And it's because of what was happening in colleges and universities, especially elite schools, where you had there the beginning of this culture of fragility, of taking offense at everything, of microaggressions, and aspiring teachers were socialized in that world to think that charters were the bad guys. They were part of the billionaire boys clubs. They were not doing something great as portrayed in Waiting for Superman that you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, but rather as the problem. So when these new teachers arrived at charter schools, they were hostile to the academic mission of the schools. They thought they should be political environments where they were waking up students to their oppression.
Right.
And that is completely at odds with the mission of great teaching. In a liberal education, a liberal arts education, you're presenting students with a variety of points of view. You're asking them to wrestle with those views and determine what they believe for themselves. But in the schools, as they became indoctrination factories. And that's stultifying for kids. And that partly explains why the results sank. But also, I should mention, let's not leave aside the most important piece, which is that discipline collapsed. Because the idea was that to have discipline is to, quote unquote, control Black and brown bodies. So a lot of educators became extremely fearful of having basic discipline and order in their classroom, lest they be labeled as white supremacists. So that's what happened, and that's why things fell apart.
We're here in Tucson, Arizona. We're very familiar with this. Our largest school district, Tucson Unified School District, has specialized in that sort of crap for 30, 40 years, right? And we were just talking about how their enrollment over the last probably 15 has collapsed in half. right? And
Yeah.
everything's repression, right? Restorative circles. They were part of a
Yes.
long-standing desegregation case that basically that people were making hundreds of thousands of dollars over. They manipulated statistics so it didn't look like Black and Hispanic kids were getting a disproportionate amount of punishment. I mean, we're in the nexus of that, Stephen, here in Tucson.
Yeah.
What
And
you're
I
saying?
think, I think what we should keep in mind is that we mock students when we claim to be empowering them, but we deny them an education. We deny them
Right.
the tools of real power and influence. What are the tools of real power and influence? Knowing things, knowledge. Knowledge is power. Being able to express oneself well in writing and in speech, being able to make a rational argument, being able to work quantitatively and analyze things. How in the world can we claim to be empowering students when they can't even do the most basic academic tasks? So I think that's not education, that's condescension.
For those of you listening on the app, we're talking to Stephen Wilson. He's a scholar at the Pioneer Institute Educational Research. And again, Stephen, we're a big belief that culture is informed by faith, family, and schools being stronger, and schools being just massive from K-12 through the college. So you're scratching us right where it itches, as we like to say in this discussion. One of the things I hear from the folks in the K-12 systems down here is, and there's a little school district called Flowing Wells that kind of goes against the grain. They said, because the child comes from a poor background, a low household income where both parents have to go out and work, they can't learn, right? That's why the scores are so bad. Like Sunnyside School District, which has about 16,000 kids, and that TUSD, their third grade literacy is somewhere between 12 and 16% of kids. So, so what do you say when people say the kid's so poor they're too poor, they can't learn? What do you say to that?
First of all, I'm sorry, I can't think of any other. The word that comes to mind is obscene, because we now know that particularly in high-performing urban charter schools, you can take students from abject poverty and have them perform as well or better than students from a well-to-do setting. That is now a proven fact, and it's not just happening in a couple places around the country. It's happening in hundreds, if not thousands, of schools. And let me just tell you just very quickly about that, because that's such an interesting case. So one of the things that drove these schools, which are referred to as no excuses schools, not because they don't make excuses for kids, but rather the adults get together and say, we're not going to make excuses about why students aren't learning. Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful idea, that you make this commitment as adults to not invoke poverty or racism or other matters. Instead, you say, within these four walls, guys, we have everything it takes to succeed with your child at a high level. That's a totally different perspective. And wow, it really works.
No, I love that idea. My argument with some of the bureaucrats at TUSD was when they say, oh, both parents are working. I assume all the kids are orphans. That's what I tell them. Assume all kids come to you orphans.
And and then when you invoke the idea of structural racism, it's just another excuse. It's just another piece of jargon. And it's not, racism is very real in America. It's pernicious, it's pervasive, all that is true. But in a school building, if you focus on quality academics, high expectations of every child, and you stop making all these excuses, then you in fact can have extraordinary outcomes. Look at the KIPP network of schools. If you attend as a child a KIPP middle school and a KIPP high school, you will statistically, you will not only get into a four-year college, but you will graduate from a four-year college at the same rate as white students nationally. That's a triumph. So we know what to do. We just need to do a lot more of it.
Stephen, what part of the world are those schools in?
Well, really all around the country. I mean, this is the largest network of urban charter schools. There's a very large. They're in the hundreds of them, and this was a massive study of their long-term effects. So the Waiting for Superman movie it was a rather triumphalist portrait of this, but the fact is, it's now actually getting done.
So I participated in an event a couple of years ago with Goldwater and the Heritage Foundation talking about academic freedom, because the state of Arizona is one of the top 2 or 3 states in academic freedom in relation to open enrollment, charter schools, tuition support, all of these, and now ESAs, empowerment scholarship accounts. And they were talking about, I think it was the state of Ohio, that as charter schools started to expand, it actually did force the K-12 government schools to up their game. Is that something that we've seen, where more charter schools, then they go, oh crap, we're losing kids? And I'm not saying the gains in the K-12s are amazing, but there is a little bit of kick up in performance. Is that something you're seeing?
It's not. It's more than yes. It's more than a little bit. There've been several studies on exactly that, and what they find is exactly what you're describing, is the greater density of charters in a district, and the more proximate they are to a traditional public school, the faster that public school improves. So the effects of competition, as you'd expect, make everyone get on their toes and get better. And this is demonstrated in multiple studies in different settings. So it's absolutely correct. Why would we take the most important function in American life, which is the education of the next generation, and deprive it of an element of competition to make it stronger, which we do in every other segment of American life? We need that. We need that press for improvement so desperately.
So let's talk about literacy, because it's just crashed. I have a very close friend of mine who teaches literacy. She works at a local school district, trying to, her job. And so a school district here in Arizona, we're in Marana, Arizona, which is the northwest part of Tucson. The school board made a bold statement, Stephen and everybody. They said, we suck at teaching reading. We've been doing it all wrong. We're doing sight words. We threw phonics in the toilet. And they said, we're not doing this right. And so they made that, which is a bold declaration for elected officials to do such things. And they reinforced what they wanted to do with that one, getting kids to third grade reading level at third grade, right? And we learned after their first year that they were at 4% of their kids in third grade were at reading level, right? And now they're at 30.
4%. Yeah.
Okay. So my question, and what I've also learned is, what she's been telling me is, now they're moving her on to 4th and 5th graders because they're pandemic kids during first and they can't read at 4th and 5th grade.
Right. So this is one of the big positive developments of the last years is the recognition that kind of failed real reading instruction had to go, and the so-called science of reading movement, and that has really taken fire quickly. And districts, in some cases, have said we were doing it all wrong, as you said, and we need to put in science of reading. We need to teach phonics explicitly. But I would say to you, the next step is that's the learning to read, but now we need to move to reading to learn, right? So we're children who can decode, but the next step is to be able to understand, is reading comprehension. And reading comprehension has been taught as if it's a skill. Well, it's not. We understand what we read because we've read broadly, and we understand all the concepts that are in the text we're reading. So we need to make schools that valorize knowledge and that expose children systematically to a whole domain of knowledge from the earliest grades. That's the only way that they're going to be great at understanding what they read. So that's the next thing, is to address the knowledge deficit and really the hostility for knowledge that has been a feature of American education system.
What an interesting phrase. The hostility towards you say for knowledge?
So I think that this is a big part of American education is this anti-intellectualism that has been present from the beginning. And in schools we venerate great athletes and sportsmen, and that's great. But we should also venerate children who are doing great things, who are expressing curiosity, who are reading broadly. And we haven't done that. We've had a kind of, as I say, a kind of hostility toward knowledge. And what we should be doing is celebrating students' curiosity. They're reading widely. They're becoming interested in something, and that's what should be encouraged. And then we would begin to change the culture of American schools.
Talk about education funding. That's another thing, right? Because we see that there's states that punch above their weight, but everyone talks about we're not funding education enough. Sometimes, like we compare Arizona, which has a lower cost of living than a New York per se. And like one of my favorite articles of stories of last year was called the Mississippi Literacy Miracle, where over 10 years they went from 49th to the best reading state in the country, Mississippi, right, with the one of the lowest per pupil expenditure rates. So talk us through the reality of funding and effectiveness of education, please.
Yeah, well, so I think the first thing to say is that America spends the first or second highest per student in the world, and real spending on education has gone up astronomically since the 1970s. So I think it's very hard to make the case that overall we're not investing enough in public education. That clearly isn't the primary problem. You have places like New York City, since you brought it up, and I'm from there, where you're spending about $35,000 per pupil, and yet the results are pretty dismal. So, but there's also, to be fair, huge differences in per student spending, as you're mentioning, and there are districts that don't have the resources to do the job. But this is not, in the main, this is not the problem. It's not a money problem. It's what we do with the money, how we organize the teaching activity, and what we value and prioritize. It comes down to how we manage education within the building. So principals who are hell-bent on educating, who make their North Star great teaching, who prepare their teachers to be successful, who have effective curricula, who have disciplined environments where students can feel safe and on task to learn, they succeed. So it's not for the most part, a resource problem.
One of the listeners messaged me. They want to ask you about. Want to know about your that the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education is this something you're in favor of? If not, how would you modify, or what is the role of the federal government, you think, if any, in the education of kids in the K-12 world?
Well, I would say that education is primarily a local and state responsibility. The federal involvement is of relatively recent vintage, at least in the form of the department from the 1970s, and we don't have a lot to show for it. That said, there is a critical function of the department, which is educational research and the administration of exams like the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that tells us what's going on. We don't want to go dark there. We need to know where children are being educated and where they aren't. So I would say that the closing of the department as a whole is a bit misleading, because its functions, for the most part, are just going to be moved to other agencies of the federal government. So it's a little bit for show. But what's important in there is that we protect the research function, which is essential to shedding light on the very failures that we're talking about today, Chris.
You brought up in that discussion, you talk about the NAEP. So talking about that kind of that standardized testing to measure, because that's something that the local people who are touchy-feely with 12% literacy rate say it's either racist or unfair to do standardized testing to see where kids are at in their learning. What would, if Stephen, do you agree? If you don't agree with that, what's the best way to do it?
Well, it's completely absurd. The standardized tests are imperfect. We can always make them better, and they are interesting developments in improving standardized tests. But of course, we want to measure what we care about. We care about students being able to read, to be able to compute, all those things. And that's what tests measure. So those who complain about the tests, it's just a distraction. They're trying to shoot the messenger. I don't think it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And figures that have a lot of influence recently in social justice education and turning away from academic education, like Ibram Kendi, say that, as you say, that testing is racist and the very concept of a standardized test is racist. That's profoundly silly. And in fact, if you look at, there was a movement away from standardized tests that was at its peak, the opt-out movement that was encouraging parents to simply not participate in testing. this was at its peak a few years ago, and you saw a large alliance of traditional civil rights organizations who came together and opposed lessening testing. They said, we need to know. And so I think we can safely say that testing, not overdone, not too much of it, is essential. And when people call for eliminating testing, you have to ask, are they trying to prevent us from seeing what's going on and how kids are not being educated in their care?
All right, and now I can talk to this guy for like 3 hours on this because I'm knee deep here. But I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'll let you get on with your day, and we'll talk again. I hope you had a good time with us. The question is, with the rise of AI, right? And we have teachers that are now using AI to see if the kid used AI, right? It's the battle of the AIs. Are we getting to the point? What does the future of education really look like? I feel like with all the AIs out there, a real education, I feel like we're going to go back to Socratic method. We're going to be kids around in a circle. Teachers know what they're doing, and we won't even have to do stupid papers anymore. And that's how we're going to do it. What do you think?
Well, I'm actually very worried about AI in teaching. I know that there's a view that AI will make for effective tutors. My worry is that the wealthy will continue to have human teachers, and low-income kids will be plunked in front of a device where they're already spending 8 or 9 hours a day, and they will be denied the real relationship with a caring human being who seeks to educate them. So I think it's profoundly concerning. I think we need to get devices out of schools. I think that they've been tremendously harmful, and I'm not sure that AI will prove any different from that. If we stop assigning long-form papers, we're going to have kids who can't assemble an argument, who can't write and can't think. So these are things I'm worried about.
I'm also worried about the homogenization of creativity in writing, right? That's because that's how we come up with new ideas. Is we keep trying, we keep writing, we keep exploring, and then if we let the computer handle 98% of what's in our paper, it's just going to be, everyone's going to be doing margarine.
I think that's exactly right. Creativity comes from juxtaposing things from different domains. You've read about this in your theater class, you've read about this in science, and you put things together. That's how creativity and innovation happens. If students aren't exposed to a vast domain of ideas and developments, they're not going to be creative people who have creative and interesting and fulfilling lives, let alone economically successful lives. So I very much agree with you.
How do people read more of your stuff, Stephen, out there on the?
The book is called The Lost Decade, and you can find it on Amazon.
I love that.
And,
can you hold that up a little higher? Can you hold that up a little higher? We didn't get really good. There it is. Thank you.
There we are.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir. What? In addition to your books, what are one or two other books that you like in the world of education out there? What do you like?
Well, I like E.D. Hirsch's books. Longstanding a scholar, a tremendous contributor, and Hirsch. Now in his 90s and still going, but he wrote a very important book called The Knowledge Deficit, which goes back to what we were saying earlier, that the real problem is that students are not gaining knowledge. They're studying skills and prepping for these tests, which is, whereas what they should be doing is reading novels and long-form books and gaining the knowledge by which they can make sense of the world and succeed in it. So I would strongly recommend that.
The book, once a month I have my libertarians on. They got me into John Taylor Gatto, Dumbing Us Down.
Yes, exactly. Well, there we go. That sums it up.
All right, Stephen, great job today, man. You were amazing. You great. I'm telling you, we'll do it again if you're up for it. Okay.
I would love to. It's great to be with you this morning.
All right. Have a good day, my friend. Take care.
You too.
That's Stephen Wilson, Pioneer Institute. When we come back, we're going to do a little reflections on our discussion with Stephen, and then Barney and I, Barney Brenner, JFK, RFK, MLK.
Those words have never been used in the same sentence.
This is going to be I have a series on of people what they're pulling out of this data dump on the JFK assassination. I'm gonna bounce it off Barney. It's gonna be good. It's gonna be good. You're on the Live the Dream Media Network. Wake up! It's a Wednesday with our good friends from Yes. 520-771-5101's the phone number. Give us a holler.